Okay, so this video is really more of a fun video, but we've been talking a lot about, across my classes, we've been talking a lot about writing technologies and linguistics and all that fun stuff. And so that led to conversations in my office hours and fun things in class. And so I'm going to talk about, I guess we've talked about why people write. People write in meaningful ways, how people use language. And so part of that discussion has led to different discussions of different writing technologies and translations and things like that. And then that led to conversations about one of the most translated texts, or probably the most translated text, I think, if I'm remembering a source correctly, in the Christian Bible. And so, or even just some of those sacred texts. Some of the reasons this is interesting from a scholarly perspective or an academic perspective just comes to that when people have a message, they do what they can to make it widely accessible. If someone's got something meaningful to say, they take time to do it. So I want to walk you through a couple key kind of moments in history real fast that are kind of fun to think about from a writing and language and writing technologies perspective. So first, so we've got a couple points in history. One is the Septuagint, which was the translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, into Greek about, I think it was like 300 BC. We have the Latin Vulgate, which is a translation from the Greek New Testament and the Greek Old Testament Septuagint into Latin, just at the end of like 380, 390, 400, 405 AD, and then also obviously what most people know is the Gutenberg press. So first, it's just pretty cool to think that there was a time in history when a culture said, this is our sacred text, this is our history, this is something important to us, and most of the people who now own this as part of their history don't speak the language enough to be able to engage with this sacred text or this important thing. So that's kind of cool. So that was what happened with the Septuagint is we're looking at a culture, a people group who had largely been embedded into the Greek culture around 300 BC and 280 and around that time. And so, as the legend kind of goes, that there were 70 scholars, or 72, that's where the sept in Septuagint comes from, and 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they all tried to translate, all wanted to do this translation of the Hebrew Scriptures and other historical books, sometimes called the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical texts. Anyway, so just from a language and writing standpoint, this was a group of people who said, we want this message that's really important to us to be more widely accessible. Okay, so that was kind of a cool moment, connecting the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, or sacred writings or scriptures, and kind of making it more palatable, more understandable to the people of their time and into a common language of their culture. So that's kind of cool. Fast forward about 600 years in the future, 380, and Jerome, who was supposed to be one of the leading Latin scholars and Christian scholars of the times, starts doing translations into Latin. The reason it's called the Latin Vulgate, vulga, like vulgar, it means common language, but in English it's come to mean something even more almost like debased language, like expletives. But at the time, the Latin Vulgate meant to be the common Latin, or the type of Latin that was spoken by most of those in the Roman Empire at the time. And so the Greek New Testament, or the New Testament, is primarily written in Greek with some quotes here and there, I believe, in Hebrew, if I'm remembering correctly, or Aramaic, but primarily a Greek New Testament, Koine Greek document, which is kind of cool. So again, as Greek faded and Latin took over, the people of the time had a powerful message they thought was important to spread to people in a meaningful way, and so translated from something that had become a scholarly language of sorts into the common language. And so that's kind of fun, two key moments. And then as we progress through history, we go up and then we start having things like the the Reformation with Martin Luther and all of that, and he starts translating the Bible, and people start translating the Bible into German. That's what, and Gutenberg was a German, though I think it was a while before he actually started printing. And actually, the Gutenberg press only printed about 180 Bibles, but at the time, this is kind of a big deal because it said that there were really only 30,000 books in Europe at the time, like total. So to have 180 of those be suddenly semi-mass produced, according to standards of the time, into a common language, in that case German, and then other translations started happening over the next 100, 150, 200 years. That's kind of a big deal. But again, it was one of these things where it was a mass disruptor of kind of socio-cultural norm, and it went from the Latin language, which, how many years passed? About a millennia almost past Jerome. And we are in the same situation where now Latin has become this carryover language that is highly academic, that has only been preserved through history because some of the main translations and documents that are said to have this sacred message or this important message, because they're all written in Latin. That's why Latin was kind of carried over through monks, through the Roman Catholic Church, and that sort of thing. And so with that, there were only certain people who were trained in that, what used to be common Latin, but now had shifted into a almost like academic power language. And so all of the doctrine and things had to be filtered through someone who knew Latin. So with the Reformation, Protestant Reformation and everything with Martin Luther, that was a shift saying we want to, and there's a lot more going on to it, but from a language and writing standpoint and a socio-cultural dynamic standpoint, it's pretty cool. It's kind of neat. That was one of those moments where, for the sake of getting a meaningful message out to more people that they cared about, people started translating into common languages yet again. And so now, in modern day culture, we see this massive reproduction of a variety of not only translations but versions, where with that particular text, people are using different modes of translation, thought for thought, word for word, and trying to continually reform it so that it's in the most common language, which is hard to keep up with nowadays. And so with the way a lot of current electronic technologies and softwares and the internet and all that spreads and changes language so much faster. So it's really pretty interesting. It's kind of it was something that came up as all my different classes. We were talking about things from writing technologies to language and the linguistic aspect of writing and its components, and how do we go from one thing to another, and writing systems and translating. So all these kind of conversations were happening, and then students were asking some of the most important reasons. And really, anytime someone has a message that is meaningful, anytime a writer wants to say something or share something meaningful, they put it on paper and spread it somehow. And so if you feel like you've got a meaningful message, look for ways to spread it. If you aren't really feeling that psyched up about or amped up about what you're saying, you're probably not going to take the time to publish it anywhere or put it anywhere. But if you have something meaningful, you also don't want to hold back. So these are just some really cool kind of moments in history with a particular vein of thought. In this case, it was the Christian scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, all that fun stuff. Moments in history where people went and took it from what had become not quite a dead language, but an older language or an academic language or a language that only a specialized group of people could really engage with, and turned it into something that common people could engage with at a much more literate level. So that's kind of fun, interesting things. There's a lot more I could say on that, but we'll just leave it at that as kind of a fun little random video midweek. Have a good day.